You're listening to Underworld on the Ghost Radio Network.
Listen.
Mountains. The unexplained. Synchronicity. EVP.
So why are you?
I heard that.
Absolutely fascinating.
What are Min-Min lights? Is it real? What do you think?
I love you.
The unseen.
I'm alright.
1111. Who or what are mutilated cattle?
Listen.
Poltergeists. Your stories. Your experiences. Listen close.
William Stillman is an autism spectrum self-advocate, consultant and author of 9 books. His latest offering, The Soul of Autism, is absolutely brilliant. I could not put it down, and it comes with a huge tick of approval and recommendation from myself. The book, The Soul of Autism, explores the aspects of spirituality through an autistic prism. It's a topic very close to my heart, as my listeners would know, and it's an absolute pleasure to have Bill back with us again tonight. I think it's your 3rd time with us tonight, isn't it, Bill?
I think it is, Leah, and thank you so much, and thank you to your listeners for inviting me back and desiring to listen in and hear what we have to say. So I'm so appreciative to be back, and thank you.
This book is brilliant. I absolutely adored it. I finished it in 3 hours, could not put it down.
Oh my gosh.
And
Goodness.
It is such a gift, and you should be so proud, my friend.
Oh, well, I have to tell you, one of the first times I was on your program, we talked about the book to which this one is the sequel, and the first book that dealt with spiritual aspects of autism was Autism and the God Connection. And when I put that book out, I really held my breath because I wasn't certain how it was going to be received at large. And I heard from people all over the world writing to thank me for telling the truth and to thank me for putting this information out there. So this time around with The Soul of Autism, I felt a little bit more comfortable. I'm still holding my breath, maybe not as deeply as the first time, because it's still very new, and it hasn't quite found its way to as many people as I would wish it would. But, you know, it's gotten a few reviews on Amazon.com already, and curiously, 2 of those reviews are from self-advocates with autism. So, you know, based on that and based on some of the feedback I'm getting and based on your reaction, I'm flattered and I'm humbled, and I'm going to keep moving forth and telling the truth about what I know.
Well, thank goodness, because I guess what you were saying before, that the Autism and the God Connection kind of made you realise that a further book was needed that focused, I guess, specifically on the soul connection or the spirituality that is very real within the autistic community. And I think I spoke with you about this the first time we chatted, that you're only confirming what parents and carers and teachers and that probably already knew. I mean, but it's not really something you can broach, or at least most people don't feel they can broach with their therapist. Hey, by the way, I think my kid might be able to read my mind. And,
right. To quote a very tired cliche, I don't make the news, I just report it, which is exactly what you're saying. So if I'm to take credit for anything, it's for perhaps having cracked open that closet door so that people don't have to feel so alone or so isolated in knowing that these experiences occur for some, not for all, but for some people on the autism spectrum. So I think that there's been a forum that's been created as a result of these 2 books now, in which maybe we're enhancing the comfort level a little bit more, about people who are willing to speak out about some of the very unusual or unconventional spiritual experiences that their loved ones and their families have endured.
And it is so refreshing to be able to, shall we say, allay any fears that parents or carers might have had, that because this is a real phenomena, and it's not something that was happening, certainly in my life, occasionally. Probably we'll go through the things you list in a minute, but one of the things that has started with Gary and has always been with my son Gary is this...
I remember you telling me the story about him being on the lawn and just laughing, and you asking what he's laughing at, and he said, the little men that are up in the mango tree.
Yes, and to this day he has a being that he chats to constantly that he refers to as Gary Boy or Gary Brother. And this is a two-way conversation, and it's a very real, everyday, ongoing thing in our life, to the point now that it's just part of our life. So
well, now, Lia, but you and I both know that outside of this conversation, if you were to tell that to a doctor or a therapist, they'd want to prescribe him antipsychotic medication.
10 years ago I would have agreed with you, Bill, but I've been very lucky, and this is something else I wanted to talk to you about. I've been very lucky in the fact that Gary's paediatrician, when I did broach this subject with him, his only comment to me was, well, does it seem to be harming him or anybody? And I said, no. He said, well, leave it be. And
wow, well, that's an exception to the rule, because here in the States it would be very different.
Is that right?
Yes, so I think you're very fortunate to have a doctor who didn't necessarily validate it, but didn't seem terribly concerned with it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I am lucky then, but this is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is, you touched on it briefly in the Soul of Autism, but do you find the autistic community or people on the spectrum have a knack of attracting to them people who either are essentially just really good or are able to find the most spiritual part of themselves and bring it out for these kids? Do you find that?
Well, it's an interesting point that you raised, because I do talk about that in the Soul of Autism, and I talk about, probably most provocatively, why the world needs and requires autism and people on the autism spectrum in it. And what I've deduced through interviews and through talking with people in person is that there are families whose lives have been completely transformed in ways that are positive and spiritual as a result of parenting the child with autism. And as you've read in the book, there are a number of anecdotes where people are talking about, I'm a better person than I know I would have been. I'm a more spiritual person than I know I would have been. One parent said, autism made me finally grow up and realize what's important. So there is that great potential for that transformative process. But then by the same token, Lia, in the book I also talk about this culture of fear that has been perpetuated by what I see as a multi-billion-dollar industry that is autism.
Yes, I love that.
It creates this us and them paradigm. And the them are those persons that are, quote-unquote, the afflicted sufferers stricken with a devastating disorder. So that really sets us apart from our humanity when we're really all more alike than different. So I don't know a lot about what's going on in Australia with regards to autism, but here in the States, the point I make in the book is that there are people with autism being severely abused and assaulted for being autistic. I mean, we're talking about electric cattle prods, or the equivalent thereof. We're talking about being locked in closets, strapped to chairs, mouths taped shut, hit, slapped, kicked, punched, bitten. And there have even been a number of incidents where parents have killed their own children because they weren't progressing, quote-unquote, or they weren't recovering or being cured. So there's a real dichotomy there.
Yes, I agree. That there was a famous case here probably 3 or 4 years ago now where a mother killed her autistic son. and they kind of blamed it on lack of respite and lots of other things. But to say,
well, here in the States, in at least one of the instances, it was sort of romanticized. And look at the sacrifice this parent made for her child, and because in that instance, the mother then took her own life after she murdered her child. And this was the sacrifice that she made, and she did it for her child and for herself and so on, which is rubbish, really. It's people who have been seduced and brainwashed by this industry that says if you're not doing all you can, if you're not working a second or third job or taking out a second mortgage on your home or renovating your basement into a therapy room, you're not the best parent you can be to your child with autism, which is a disservice.
Oh, I so agree with that. And yes, there is still very much a lot of that around. And here in Australia, you are given, say, a grant or some money from the government, and all of the different services are vying for that money. They know you've been given this money upon diagnosis, and they want to. It's like they're selling you their therapies. Try us because of this.
Wow.
It's very, it can be quite overwhelming when people are pitching their therapies to you to get your grant money, basically. Or at least that's the way it felt to me. Perhaps that was just my perception. But
well, it sounds competitive, and I'm wondering how many parents are savvy to it and aren't willing to fall for the first provider of service who says ours is the best.
Exactly. And again, there's that whole overtone of, we can make your child better. We can make the dreaded autism thing go away, And
right. Well, I've met some of those kids who are supposedly recovered or cured, and, they still have autism. They've just managed to suppress a lot of their traits so that in the moment they pass for normal.
Are they very sad, Bill?
Pardon me?
Are they very sad, in your opinion, upon meeting them? Are they very sad? Or
Are they very sad? To me, they seemed like little robots, sort of programmed to do what it was that Mom and Dad expected them to do in the moment, but they were still autistic.
Yeah.
The one little fella, there were some beautiful shadows that were being thrown on the wall by a tree outside the window, and his mother was prompting him to interact with me, and this poor little fella was so distracted by the shadows, and I finally just said, those are really lovely, aren't they? Why don't we go over and take a closer look? Because there was a breeze outside, and the tree limbs were moving, and then, of course, the shadows were moving on the wall. And we had a lovely exchange.
And it wasn't even though the child was autistic and engaging in, let's say, autistic behaviours, to you it wasn't a terrible thing. It was a positive experience. It was, you were interacting just with the child.
Right, but his mistake, according to Mother, was that he wasn't interacting appropriately or in ways that would be considered typical or normal, quote unquote. So she was disappointed. I thought it was great.
Yeah. So again, it comes back to perception, and I think it was Jim Sinclair wrote a wonderful piece that I had on my webpage, which I know you mentioned in your book, called "Don't Mourn for Us," and I find the coping strategies and the way these children are able to see what each person requires of them, whether it be a teacher, a parent, or just somebody in the neighbourhood, and become that for them. I think it's extraordinary that they're able to do all of those things. A little sad, but it's extraordinary.
Right, and I don't mean to send the message that when someone is on the autism spectrum, we do nothing. We certainly want to very lovingly and caringly support someone to try to integrate with the world as much as they're able and to give them language skills. But how we do that is, I think, what's the difference. And what I'm putting forth in the book is a concept called entrainment, which is the harmonious patterns that develop when hearts and minds align in the context of respectful and reciprocal relationships. And there's a number of examples then of the fruits from that when that occurs between parent and child, between parent or child and members of the animal kingdom, In one instance that I give in the book, there's a little boy who's absolutely enthralled with plants and shrubs and trees, and he has a special connection with them. So, there are unlimited possibilities that can come when we sort of abandon this normalization agenda and really just focus on presuming the intellect of the individual and developing those peer relationships.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about presuming intellect, because I know it's very important to you, and you go into great depth about it in the book, as you should. Why?
Thank you.
Why should we presume intellect where these kids and these adults are concerned?
Because that is the proper response to autism. There is a very prevalent myth and stereotype that suggests that up to 90% of persons with autism are mentally retarded, and it's simply not so. Any one of us would fail an IQ exam if we couldn't speak or didn't have a voice that was always reliable for us to draw from, if we were in a strange environment being interviewed by a stranger asking us to do odd or meaningless or purposeless activities that didn't make a lot of sense to us. Any one of us would get the intelligent quotient equivalent of someone with an intellectual impairment. The truth of what we know to be autism is that we must re-envision it in the same way that we would for the person who is recovering from a stroke, the person who has cerebral palsy, or Hodgkin's, or Parkinson's, or Tourette's, or Lou Gehrig's disease. The competence of the person is completely intact within. It's that the physical is not of service to that person.
Yes.
So we need to see past the physical and look beyond labels in favor of presuming the intellect of the person within, and then adapt the way we interact with that person accordingly. So what I often find myself telling people, Lia, is in my work as a consultant, about 90% of what I do has absolutely nothing to do with the individual with autism. It has everything to do with creating that kind of transformation in and among the people around that person.
So they actually think they've employed you or asked you to come along to consult with the child, but in the actual fact that you end up just explaining, leaving what the child's doing alone and just explaining the child to the caregivers. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly so, yes. And it's a delicious irony, isn't it?
It is. It's fantastic. I'm hoping you'll know what it is. I went through my emails today looking for something that I kept a couple of months ago. It was an extraordinary piece that I saw on YouTube about a woman who, it's about a 10-minute piece, and she's autistic, and the first half of the video is her flicking with water and making noises and doing all sorts of strange, quote-unquote, things. And then the second half of the video is the woman using FC, basically explaining what she was doing and why she was doing it. Now, if that doesn't prove presuming intellect, I don't know what does. It was amazing, and I sent it to everybody and said, you must watch this.
And your listeners should look at it, too. Her name is Amanda Baggs, B-A-G-G-S, and the title of her film on YouTube is called In My Language. And I just want to gently correct something that you said, if I may. She is not using facilitated communication, but is in fact typing independently.
Oh, okay.
So there's no one facilitating her communication with physical support. She's actually typing independently.
Right.
But as you said, how can you possibly argue with that? And so if anyone needs to see the concept presuming intellect in motion, in real life, as we've been discussing, I would absolutely advise folks to take a look at that film on YouTube. In My Language, it's called.
I knew that you would know. It was the most fantastic thing, and I know I've still got it buried somewhere, but I have so many things buried that are important to me. Sometimes it can be hard to locate them, but that was one of the most profound things I'd ever seen. It was fantastic.
But, you know, Lia, she has taken a lot of hits and a lot of criticism from people who still insist that's not really her or it's all contrived, which is just amazing to me.
Really? Well, I think that says a lot more about them than it does about Amanda.
Well, it does.
I wanted to go over the points in your book so that people can really identify what we're talking about. You list basically the main spiritual threads that have come to light. Let's touch on number one, the knowledge of existence before birth.
That's actually a fairly common one. And again, some of these concepts I introduced in the first book, Autism and the God Connection, and based on how that was received, I felt confident enough to explore some of these concepts a little bit more in depth. The knowledge of existence before birth pertains to those individuals with autism who can speak, talking about having lived in another place or time, or talking about having selected their parents prior to being born, which I think is really fascinating. One little boy in particular told his mother, just sort of out of the blue in a very nonchalant manner, that I had the choice between you and a Japanese couple, and I chose you because I didn't want to learn Japanese because it's too intricate and complex a language.
Wow.
Another little fella was sitting next to his mom as they were driving somewhere, and he was sort of manipulating a chocolate bar wrapper. And she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm making a paper squid." And then he started talking to her about squid and fishing and lots of detail about fishing. And she said, "Well, where did you learn that from?" And he said, "Well, from Grandpa." And the thing is, this woman's grandfather was an avid fisherman. He knew a lot of the same kind of details that this little fellow was talking about, but he had died when this woman was 16 years old.
So they must have had like a conversation in spirit before he arrived, perhaps.
Perhaps it was that, or perhaps it was something else. So this is the sort of thing that's very commonplace, and people may really write this sort of thing off and say, well, that's just childish imagination, or in the worst case scenario, my child's hallucinating, what do I do about it? But we do need to remember, and you can validate this through Gary also, that those of us on the autism spectrum really interpret things in ways that are very literal and very concrete, and we say what we mean and we mean what we say. So we're not often prone to flights of fancy or grandiose imaginative schemes. We really do tell it like it is.
Yeah, and I always find that interesting. People say, you know, particularly in the case of people on the autism spectrum, imagination. I think, well, you obviously don't actually know that much about, you know, autism, because all of Gary's imaginings come from something like The Simpsons or Futurama, or something that he has a basis of. It's not...
Exactly.
You know,
exactly. So we're not saying that people with autism are devoid of imagination. That's not true. We can be very creative and very imaginative, but you're absolutely right. It oftentimes has a point of inspiration that is the source of the creativity. But where some of these other things are concerned that just sort of come out of the blue, again, we call it as we see it.
Exactly. So it's certainly intriguing. Next one here, precognition or premonition, and you mentioned from simple things like a lunch menu to major highway accidents. I've got to say that touched a chord with me, because Gary is he's highly intuitive and has premonitions, but I call them autistic premonitions, because on the way home, about a year ago now, he said to me, "What's for dinner?" And I said spaghetti, and which is one of his most favourite things. And he said, "Uh-oh, no spaghetti." And I said, no, I've got pasta, I bought spaghetti. And he was insistent, no spaghetti, no spaghetti. And when I got home, of course, there was no spaghetti. And I said to John, I wonder why he can't come up with the lotto numbers. It's always something that pertains to, do you know what I mean?
That would be a misuse of the gift.
Yeah. So
that would be a misuse.
So even his...
But you're right, and I do hear from parents on a fairly regular basis who want to share their stories, and that's one of the themes that I hear most frequently is my child was having a temper tantrum, quote unquote, in the car, and we had to pull over, and once he calmed down, we got back in the road, and just up ahead on the road was this horrific, multi-car collision that we surely would have been in the middle of if that hadn't happened. So it's that sort of thing that has the potential to occur, and again, people need to really pay attention to, the sum total of the equation sometimes by putting two and two together.
Yes, and the next one, telepathy, inserting images in carers' and parents' minds. I found this one perhaps the most helpful, because when Gary was much younger and when he was tantruming and he was confused and he was anxious, getting him to speak was probably the worst thing you could possibly do at that time. So I used to say to Gary, send me a picture. And more often than not, I found that worked. And it was enough of a picture to be able to understand what might have been causing the anxiousness at that time.
There's a really lovely story in the Soul of Autism that's almost identical to that, where a mom and her son finally are able to connect in that manner. And she sends him a picture of being encased in a beautiful bubble, like Glinda from The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
And especially when he goes into unfamiliar environments or social settings that may cause him to feel very anxious. And she says that works for him. Now, I've got to tell you, Lia, I have been pretty severely criticized by some people who are upset with me that I'm suggesting that telepathy is possible in persons with autism, let alone other human beings. But what my critics overlook is my argument for that, which is those of us who are spiritual or religious in nature practice telepathy every day, and it's what we call prayer.
Exactly.
And if we didn't believe in the power of those times of solace with God or our Creator, however we call him or her, we'd stop doing it. And if we're created each as human beings in God's image, then what's to say we don't have the capacity for communicating with God in the same way that we would for one another?
Yes, very true. You devote a whole chapter in your book to, I believe it's your friend's name, Michael, and his musings about God, which I found were extraordinary, just simply beautiful. And and thank him for that. When you see him, just tell him I thought that it was the way he discusses God, and he goes on to explain that autistics are not they're different. They're not broken, and it's just wonderful stuff.
He's still a teenager, but his words have really touched many people, and he's a gorgeous human being.
Absolutely. The next one, which I found very interesting, animal communication, having had quite a few animal communicators on the show, particularly a friend of mine, Scott Alexander King, who was a former teacher and who is now an animal communication and an animal healer. And he has written a book about monkey archetypes, and he believes all children are a different type of monkey archetype. But this one I found interesting because I tried writing for the disabled and things like that with Gary, and this is one thing he does not have. He doesn't like animals, he doesn't want them near him, and the whole animal communication thing wasn't happening for me, but I know for other people it certainly was.
Yes, and you raise a very good point, Lia, and that is that we're not talking about all people with autism, and we're not suggesting that all of these gifted capacities are inherent and present in each individual. We all have gifts and talents to offer the world. I believe that we all have spiritual gifts and talents that are hardwired into us. And the neat thing about being human is that those gifts and talents are going to be unique and look differently in each and every one of us, to varying degrees at different vibratory frequencies and so on. So you're right, we're not talking about all people, and I'm not surprised that this is an area that doesn't interest Gary, and that's fine. That's just who he is. Animals can be very unpredictable, which is why a lot of people with autism can shy away from them, particularly dogs, who can bark suddenly and without warning. But there are some people with autism that, like St. Francis, seem to be free of ego and have this sort of continuous flow of energy and communication with members of the animal kingdom. And there's a lovely story in the book, The Soul of Autism, about this young girl who is from Louisiana here in the States and has that very capacity. And her mother was taking her to visit her mother's sister, and they have a farm with some cattle. And this mom says, well, every time we go to visit the farm, my little girl goes over to the fence, and no matter where the cattle are in the pasture area, they all get up and they come over to her and crowd around her. And the one evening, they were getting ready to leave, and Mom went out to go get the daughter, and she's just standing there staring at the cattle. And so Mom just sort of thought to say, what do you think the cows want to say? And the little girl, without even looking up or acknowledging Mother, said, goodbye, they're saying goodbye. And the mother followed up with me about a week or so later to say that she learned that all of those cattle were scheduled to be slaughtered.
Interesting on two levels, really. A, that the animals knew they were ready to be slaughtered. They obviously knew that intuitively. And B, that the little girl was able to pick up on that. It's extraordinary.
You're right, that the animals were aware that something ominous was pending, but that they seemed to have accepted that by communicating to the girl, farewell, goodbye, we won't be seeing you again.
Exactly. I suppose the most probably famous autistic individual with animals would have to be Temple Grandin, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, she's basically... she's done so well with her animal machines, and then the hug machine from that, and extraordinarily just the way she's able to, be the very best that she can be, because she's, like she said, she basically understands what the animals are feeling and what they're thinking.
Right, and I do quote from her book, Animals in Translation, in my own book, when she talks about her postulating that animals think in pictures in the way that many autistics think in pictures and movies, as do I. But what she doesn't talk about is how that works and what it is that the animals are saying, which is what I explore in this new book.
Going a little bit more in depth into why it, rather than how. Communion with benign ethereal entities defined as angels by some, two-way interaction. Obviously that's a big one for us, because that's probably Gary's biggest thing with Gary Boy or Gary Brother, whoever.
Yes. Yes. Well, you see, the deeper we go down this list, the more difficult it gets for people to be accepting of some of these concepts. But I have to believe there's something to this when people from, hundreds or thousands of miles apart are telling me the same things. I mean, virtually identical stories, and these people don't know one another. But what that pertains to is oftentimes, in some, not all, persons with autism, that individual will go off to experience a time of solitude and contemplation on a regular basis, if not daily, usually in the same place at the same time of day. And what has been observed is that individual is having an interaction, or what appears to be a two-way conversation. And what has also been consistently reported to me is that after that period of solitude passes, the individual emerges seemingly refreshed and replenished and rejuvenated and joyful and laughing and smiling and desiring then to share that with other people. My theory is that individuals who appear to be severely limited are not simply thrust into this world without any kind of compensation. And I think the compensation is regular counseling and mentoring from a higher source. That may be in the form of an angel or a spiritual protector or a guide of some sort. And I think that this is what is happening on those occasions, that it's sort of a mini counseling session. You're doing great. Keep going. I know it's hard. I know it's a difficult life. But, look at the big picture. You fit into the universe. You're entitled to the space that you occupy, and so on. I think it's happening during these sessions.
I so agree with that, and I think again it gets back to Michael again, who you mentioned in your book, where he mentions, and this was very profound for me, where he mentions that autistic people are different; they're not broken, and perhaps the soul connection that they still have with the source, whoever you want to call that, is much stronger with autistic people rather than say the rest of us. Would that be true?
Well, right. Michael talks about his experience this lifetime as being a whole soul in a broken body.
Yeah.
As opposed to the commonest version, which is a broken soul in a whole body. In other words, in a body that works.
Yes.
Now, I think that we all have the potential to be spiritual and to tap our gifts and talents. So I don't want to polarize people with autism in another extreme, which is the Rain Man type savant or people who are somehow superior. That's not what I'm saying. But I think you do have a point. And what I talk about in the book is what I call the dichotomy of consciousness, and it's sort of a way to get the layperson to understand the shift in human dynamics that occurs when you have a body that doesn't work properly, but your intellect is intact. So the example I use is one that many people can refer to, which is if you've ever awakened in the middle of the night and your arm is asleep from the elbow down, and it's just gone dead because the circulation is cut off. So your brain is willing that limb to move, and it simply will not stir of its own accord. So imagine if that same nighttime paralysis transferred to any number of limbs in your body or lodged itself in your voice box. That would be what it would feel like to be someone in an autistic body, and your intellectual capacity is intact. There's just that brain-body disconnect. So what we want to get people thinking in terms of is, all right, people who are normal, quote-unquote, or neurotypical are so focused on the physical and gratifying physical needs in every moment of the day that we tend not to think in terms of what would it be like if that were reversed, and we focused exclusively on the cerebral instead. And that's the point I'm trying to get across.
Yes, and said very well, very well. This is why you must get this book, people. It's truly one of the most insightful books you'll ever read about autism, and I will make that point that Bill does say several times through the book that he's not trying to say autistic people are better or give anybody a messiah complex, but
thank you.
That there is this dichotomy that we must acknowledge. And I also wanted to say, when you were talking about the counselling and what have you went on, from a purely practical point of view, when this Gary boy or Gary brother made himself present many years ago, regardless of my belief system, which is, obviously the afterlife and things that are unseen are still there, and et cetera, I listened to what this conversation was for a long time, and basically, regardless of who Gary brother is and who Gary boy is, he's great. Gary will get something out of the fridge, say for instance a soft drink or a soda, and he'll put it on the table and then he'll put it back, and I'll say, what are you doing? And he'll say, no, the Gary brother said I've had too much soda today. And I'm thinking, I love Gary brother. I don't know who he is, but he gives great advice. He gives really good advice. He gives that's the type of one of my friend who's much more practical, shall we say. To me, she said that Gary brother is my voice inside Gary's head, basically saying what I would say. Don't you think you've had enough of that today? Put it back and have the rest tomorrow. Or, you really shouldn't be taking that many biscuits, etc., etc., etc. And this is the type of advice that Gary brother or Gary boy tends to instow. It's good, practical, safe advice. So, he can stay for as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and I think that's the measuring stick. Is it harmful or is it helpful? And something that we haven't touched upon, and again, we keep getting deeper and deeper here, is in the last year, Lia, I have seen a dramatic spike in the numbers of individuals with autism, usually young children, who are waking up in the middle of the night between midnight and 3 a.m. screaming in terror, completely overwhelmed hysterical with terror, refusing to sleep in their own bedrooms, sleeping between mom and dad every night, becoming very anxious about going to bed at night. And so that's something else that we need to be thinking about. And I don't explore that too deeply in this book. I think I'm going to save that for another book. But I do share another chapter on a man who was experiencing something like that for 20 years of his life.
Yes.
And the repercussions of that.
It was extraordinary, that chapter, and extraordinary the way you followed through with that, and it's extraordinary. People will have to buy the book to really get the real essence of that story, but it's certainly intriguing, and it's certainly something that happened to Gary when he was about, I suppose, 2 or 3. He did that for a spate of about 6 months, and it didn't matter what we did, he'd wake up screaming, and then we found the only way to snap him out of it was to put him in the shower, and that would wake him up pretty quick. But it was wherever he was, it was a heartbreaking place as his mother, because I knew that he was frightened and he was terrified, and in essence he did not know that I was there until we were able to snap him back out of it by putting him in the shower.
Well, I don't, outside of the chapter that's in the Soul of Autism, I don't explore it in the book. There is a protocol about that I've posted to my website, because I wanted to help other families that were going through this. I think that, there are ill-intended presences that roam this world, seeking to attach to those individuals who are most vulnerable, people who have addictions, or are in abusive situations, or are severely depressed or have other mental health issues, but also those of us who are vibrating at a higher frequency than other people. And in my opinion, I'm beginning to see what's starting to feel like a bit of a power struggle around these ill-intended presences trying to seize hold of and manipulate certain persons who are very vulnerable.
I think anybody who has that happening should, I always refer them to Edgar Cayce, who, when his, what he did when he went to sleep, as they called him, the sleeping prophet, because he wasn't asleep, he was in a state where he was able to roam the astral, basically. And in the many highly detailed recordings and seminars and writings that he has, he quite often speaks about having beings or people or whatever you want to call them wanting to talk to him, and he acknowledges in his speech he cannot dwell here. He wants to help, but he cannot dwell here. He must move past this. And I think anybody who's wondering more about this, if they read Edgar Cayce's writings about this, would find a lot more detail about what might be happening. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Edgar Cayce's writings at all.
I have not read his writings. People have told me that a good deal of what I've written sort of mirrors a lot of what he's explored, which is curious to me. But on my website, there's actually a protocol I've written for parents who are enduring this, and then steps to take around how to remedy it.
Is that the one that you list in your book as well? Or maybe I read it on your website. I must have read it on your website.
Well, the website is simply my name, which is williamstillman.com, and there's an Autism and the God Connection portion of the website, and you'll see there's a link there where it says click here for the spiritual protocol, and I help people to sort through what may or may not be going on. But in terms of those kids that are waking up absolutely terrified, and we're not just talking about a bad dream or a nightmare that happens occasionally, we're talking about repeatedly every night in a row, sometimes for months on end. This is happening for some kids.
So if
I talk about what I have done to remedy that, how I've counseled families through that, and what has been successful.
Yes. So get on over to williamstillman.com. Of course, that webpage is off Ghost Radio's front page now. You can see William's very handsome face there and the cover of his book, and you can click on through to his webpage from Ghost Radio and find that piece there if this is happening to your children or to anybody that you know. Bill, we're almost
I'm sorry, Lia. I just want to caution people, too, that, some of what we're talking about is really pretty far-out stuff for the average person. And just have an open mind, please, and take a look at what I've written, because too many parents who are experiencing this are being told your child needs to be on Risperdal or some other sort of medication, and that's going to make it better. And I'm suggesting something different. So, weigh all the options. I know that what I've written and what we've been talking about tonight isn't for everyone. I understand that. But weigh all the options and have an open mind is what I'm asking.
Well, I guess it comes back to the yardstick we were talking about. I couldn't possibly believe that anything you've written on your webpage is going to harm a child. So, I'm sure go through what Bill's written, and if it's not intrusive in any way or it's not in any way offensive to you, well, then what harm could it do?
Exactly.
So that's always the best yardstick, really.
I think so, too. Thank you.
I wanted to, we're almost out of time. You've been very generous with your time, as usual, but I wanted to touch briefly on what I mentioned at the top of the interview, where people on the autism spectrum, in my mind, and particularly I've seen it with Gary, case in point, this week Gary got a new bank card, and I took him to the ATM machine, and I took him to the shop to show him how to use it. And when we got to the checkout, I was showing Gary how to swipe it through the thing, and he was a little bit anxious because it was new and he didn't want to make a mistake, and I think he was a bit worried that all his money might disappear, lots of things going through his head and that type of thing. So highly anxious situation. And the lady behind the counter, she obviously instantly saw that there was something going on here, and instantly just became the most kindest, patient, wonderful person, including the 3 or 4 people who by now were behind Gary. And, and he's flapping and getting a little anxious, and so I did it again, swipe it through, PIN number, which he was very anxious not to say out aloud because I'd kind of drummed into his head, don't tell anybody your PIN number, and, very important steps going on. So, and of course he was very proud because this was his own money. And I know people have had experiences to the contrary, but I find, in my mind, and in my experiences personally, that whenever Gary encounters or in a situation like this happens, the most patient, kind, willing, perhaps most godly part of people comes out of them, where they're willing to wait, they're willing to understand, they're willing to just, let it evolve, what is happening here evolve. And I think that's extraordinary. Have you found that as well?
I think that's just lovely. And, I have yet to meet a person with autism who has not in some capacity communicated or demonstrated their desire to teach. And what people have communicated to me consistently is that not only do they want to teach about autism, they want to teach the most salient themes of the human experience as brothers of one another, kindred in our humanity, which are, of course, patience and compassion and tolerance and sensitivity, and, of course, unconditional love. So when I write in the Soul of Autism that the world needs autism, I also talk about, the narrowing of the statistics around the incidence of autism, and that, skyrocketing rather dramatically. And I think we're going to continue to see that narrow. And there's still no single known cause, and it's 4 to 5 times more likely in males. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens over the next several decades or beyond that, if there's going to be a softening of aggression in the male gender, which we could use, and how much of the population ultimately ends up being autistic. And are we looking at, or are we in the midst of, what could be defined as an evolutionary process? Very interesting, and I think more interesting times lie ahead.
I loved that in the book where I think it was a mother that you were quoting said she considers autism evolution, really.
Yes, and then I take it a step further and suggest, well, maybe it's revolution.
Exactly, the spiritual evolution and revolution we've all been waiting for. It's fascinating stuff. Another fascinating chapter as well, that I want to touch on briefly, just to let people know that it's in there. And another reason why they should get a copy of The Soul of Autism is your startling similarities between autistics and dolphins.
Yes, well, that's in the chapter about animals, and I decided to explore that concept of comparing and contrasting people who are vibrating at a higher frequency with dolphins who are vibrating at a higher frequency, based on that little girl of whom I told the story of earlier, and the cattle. And her mother was saying that when she imitates what animals are saying to her, she oftentimes will use this sort of high-pitched, high-frequency sound that her mother said sounded like the sounds that dolphins make. And I've heard of enough stories of kids visiting aquariums and seaquariums to know that, there's a connection there when, a child with autism will go to the glass and all the dolphins will come over and nod and tap the glass and so on. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be curious? Because I knew that dolphins were like the aquatic equivalent of human beings. They're very, very similar in many respects. And some of it I was quite surprised to learn. And, I don't want to upset people or freak people out by saying I'm comparing autistics with animals. I'm not doing that. But there are similarities there in the ways in which some people with autism and some dolphins communicate. And I just thought it was very intriguing.
It is very intriguing. As I said, you've been extraordinarily generous with your time. Thank you so much. Final question.
My great pleasure.
We've talked about presuming intellect, but tell us, final question, what effect does presuming intellect have on relationships with those with autism? Why is it so important that we presume intellect? How does it help the autistic?
Oh, my goodness. Because there are countless people with autism living in silence, and even those who can speak, who are devalued and degraded and written off, who are waiting patiently for parents and educators and caregivers to get it, to see them, to see that we are not separate. We are all kindred in our humanities. We're all brothers of one another. We are all more alike than we are different. And everyone has autism to one degree or another. We talked about having the dead arm in the middle of the night, and that's a pretty universal experience. If you've ever stumbled or halted or stuttered or blocked spoken language, that's a brain-body disconnect, misfire, and blip. That's an autism. If you've ever driven from point A to point B, and you get to point B and you have no recollection of the drive, that's an autism. You've been on autopilot. If you happen upon someone in the community and you're seeing them out of the context in which you know them and you can't remember their name, that's an autism. If you associate a certain aroma or scent with one person in your life, that strong associative connection, that's an autism. So we really need to discard and dismantle the prejudice and the walls of indifference to embrace one another, because many people with autism are the keepers of great wisdom, and I'm hoping that people will benefit from those aspects by reading the book.
Extremely well said, and I sure hope they do as well. The book, again, is The Soul of Autism. William's website is williamstillman.com. All of that information is available off the website. I guess the best place to get the book from is Amazon, Bill?
I'm not certain how it's being distributed in Australia or if it's in bookstores there yet. Certainly people in Oz can order it from Amazon.com. Here in the States, it's available at all major bookstores, and certainly for many people who are parenting kids with autism, it's easier to simply go online at Amazon.com and they may find it there.
Exactly, but it's been my experience that if you really want a book, we have Dimmicks and Angus and Robinson over here, very much the same as your Barnes & Noble. Go in there and order it. They'll get it for you. Doesn't matter what it is. If you want it and you pay for it, they'll order it in. So get Bill's book,
Terrific.
And the more people who order it, then the more people, they'll start stocking it just as a regular in the bookshop, which is what we really want. Thank you.
Yes, because we want to create that transformation in thinking.
Exactly. Thank you for all of the wonderful hard work you've done, all of the listening, all of the research, all of the just being you, I guess.
Well, I'm grateful. I'm appreciative of the time that you've granted me. It's been my privilege. Every morning before I go into an interview or a presentation or a consultation, I say a prayer, and I ask to be of good and great service. So I hope I've been that for your listeners tonight. I hope that I've been of good and great service to them and to you as well.
Always, my friend, always. You have a spot on Ghost Radio anytime you like. You'd know that. And thank you again.
My great pleasure. Thank you, and good night.
Okay, that's Underworld for this week. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe, and blessings to you all.
You've been listening to Australia's own Underworld Show with host Lia Ramses. The Underworld Show is produced in Perth, Western Australia by iProdigy Communications exclusively for Ghost Radio Australia and the Ghost Radio Network. Tune in every Sunday at 8 p.m. Perth time to hear fascinating guests and topics such as the one you just listened to. For more information on upcoming guests, events, and breaking news, visit www.underworldshow.com or www.ghostradio.com.au.